In premarital counseling, I think that's something a lot of couples, they come in for if they have the awareness that maybe, kind of exploring some of these different topics would be helpful. So I do have like a specific list of topics that I go through. One of the questions that I saw was, generally how many sessions is it? My premarital couples asked that as well. It's usually about 10, I would say about 10 sessions. Sometimes it'll go maybe a session or two longer or shorter, depending on, each couple. But yes, that's kind of where I like to start. And I'm very open with a couple too. I think it's helpful when they're pretty open to whether or not, they're compatible with one another as well. So that's something that we really explore into their relationship dynamic.
That's great. Okay, great. So right off the bat, you helped answer one of the questions that was submitted, and that is like, yeah, is there an ideal number of sessions? You mentioned 10, give or take a few. Any particular reason why 10 seems to be a nice, comfortable number for you?
I think there's 10 topics that I like to go over, but I think also for couples who are not familiar, with therapy, maybe this is the first time they've had therapy, that ongoing, session or commitment can seem very overwhelming. And therapy is an investment, right? And so when they can really sit down and figure out, budgeting purposes, the time commitment. Most people can, carve out an hour of their time for about 10 weeks, 2.5 months. And so I find that to be really helpful for the couple.
You mentioned 10 topics. I don't know whether you have this offhand, but I think that question is one of the first ones that was asked, is what are some important topics to cover in premarital counseling? So do you have any initial thoughts about that?
I do. I actually have that list in front of me, if that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the topics that I typically go over in premarital counseling is conflict resolution. That's a really, really big one. Hi, Annie.
Hi.
Conflict resolution, I go over personal values. What is it? Even if people are believers, non-believers, do they share a shared value system? I also go over financial decisions. That's a big one, finances with a couple and how to intertwine that together. I go over career moves. Like, what does that look like if one partner gets the job of a lifetime, but it takes them across the country and someone else has their career here? What happens then?
Yes.
Talk about family planning. That's a really important topic too. And a big one is the in-laws and family dynamics, because now it's not just the couple. Now we're marrying two, different family systems together. So that's something that catches a lot of couples off guard. And that's something that I'm open about in our sessions too, is what does that look like? What are the expectations? What are the family systems that are in place? I also go over romance and intimacy, whether it's physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, those are all really important too, and how to maintain that. And also social interactions, maybe one person is an introvert, one is an extrovert. What will that look like as a couple? I also go over religion, believers, non-believers, how they choose to raise their family, and household chores and what that looks like as well. So those are my 10 topics that I generally go over.
That's wonderful. Annie, welcome.
Hi,
hope the mattress delivery went okay.
Yes, it went fine, but yeah, sorry I'm late.
No problem. Yeah, Helen and you will be the primary therapist talking about premarital counseling today, and then we've got two pastors in the chat room today as well, Kevin and Joshua. They're the ones that sent most of the questions for today. And there are so many questions that I don't think we can get through all of them in 1 hour, but we'll get through as many as possible and maybe save the ones that we don't get to for another Zoom call. So, okay, so far we've covered, is there an ideal number of sessions? And also, what are some important topics to cover in premarital counseling? If you don't mind, I'm just going to go straight through these questions and we'll just tackle them one by one. How much time prior to the wedding should couples start premarital counseling? Do you two have an idea about that?
I think it can be flexible. I generally feel like, when the couples engage, kind of however long that engagement process is, that would make sense to start looking at premarital counseling. But I think it can be flexible depending on the couple's schedule, the pastor's availability.
I would agree. I said like 6 to 12 months. I think as close as the wedding draws closer, they get more frazzled and the pressure becomes more intense. And so 6 to 12 months felt like a pretty good time gauge just to give the couple that space and time that they needed to really explore their relationship.
When I was pastoring, I think there were times either, gosh, I can't remember whether these were people who came to me for premarital counseling or I was in conversation with other pastors, but like they would be engaged and then like the wedding is like 3 months away and then they want to do like shotgun 5 sessions, right before. And I'm like, so what's the purpose of such, I felt like the wedding was going to be a foregone conclusion. So this is just you trying to do some sort of quick supplemental thing. It just didn't feel effective for me. And so that's why when I became a counselor, I actually offered pre-engagement counseling for those who are seriously dating and who have not yet popped the question so that they can really go through some of these big ticket topics and realize, whoa, we are far apart in how we view parenting or how we view how much involvement in-laws have in our lives or how much, we view, like saving versus spending and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really big topic. And I do think that though there isn't an ideal time of prior to the wedding, I think there's a danger zone that if it's too close to the wedding, then it kind of feels like I'm not quite sure what we're doing here,
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I think in general, it's good to get that process rolling earlier rather than later.
That's right.
I love doing pre-engagement work as well. Like
Yeah.
I think a lot of times couples think that counseling is when the relationship is in dire trouble, but it really doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
It's a very preventative sort of measure.
Yeah. And I think not a trouble, but I think one of the difficult things here is that most pastors know who's dating in their congregation. And we all know that there is health in having these talks well in advance of either the wedding or even of the engagement. But it's not like the pastor's in a position where they don't want to be like helicopters, they don't want to be like, hey, so are we going to talk about this? Are we going to, and then if they sit back and kind of wait for the couple to come to them and say, hey, we got engaged and, we'd like for you to do premarital with us. And oh, by the way, the wedding is in 1 month. Like the pastor's like, dude, come on. Like, what do you want me to do with this, right? So I do want to acknowledge that pastors are in a tricky spot when it comes to either sitting back or trying to be too aggressive when it comes to because ultimately this falls upon this responsibility falls upon the dating people, Okay, here's another question. What do you think are some of the biggest mistakes that pastors and then in parentheses, non-professional counselors make with premarital counseling?
That's something that I was just about to piggyback off of what you just said, Roy, where pastors are kind of in this predicament of timing, when to lean in, right, and be involved and when to kind of sit back. And I feel like the biggest assumption is when pastors assume that an engaged couple, they're going to get married. Like, I think it's like a given, right? And premarital counseling is just the next precursor to, their wedding. And, I don't see it that way. And it's really, and I think premarital counseling, I really like the pre-engagement. I think that's much more helpful, and it's less pressure on the dating couples, because that's what, if you're already engaged, your friends and family know, they're expecting, this big day to happen. And so it's also, it's just added unnecessary pressure for the couple. But yes, I mean, I've had very honest conversations with my couples, even after they're engaged, about whether or not it's about compatibility and, their ability to work through their differences. And if they cannot come to some middle ground, that kind of sets the tone already for their marriage. So that's something that I wish would be more openly discussed, that just because they're engaged, they don't always have to follow through with the wedding if they feel like it's not right for them.
Great point. Let's pause here and see if the pastors, Kevin and Joshua, have any sort of follow-up comments or questions about the 1, 2, 3, 4 questions that have been talked about so far.
I guess quick follow-up question regarding the number of sessions, and thank you guys again for doing this. It's really helpful. And there's some, I guess the recommended number of sessions was 10, just kind of seeing like spacing wise, how frequently the session should be, whether it should be weekly or give more time to process. And I'm sure it depends on each couple, but seeing if there was kind of a baseline.
Yeah.
I think there is definitely flexibility there. I typically do it on a weekly session. If for some reason there's a budgeting finance issue or a conflict of schedule, then, maybe we'll push it out to bi-weekly. But for the most part, I think most couples, it's another, to-do thing that they want to kind of get off that checklist. So I typically see them on a weekly basis.
Yeah, same here. I think I usually do see couples on a weekly basis, but I think maybe in terms of pastors doing the premarital counseling, I feel like there might be some more flexibility. I think that just tends to be how a lot of therapists do, like our sessions is weekly or kind of every other week. When I think about the number of sessions, so one model that I think is really useful to draw from, it's called Prepare and Enrich, and I think they recommend kind of 6 to 10. So I think depending on when they started the process and when the wedding is, you can kind of lay out what makes sense. Yeah.
I think another mistake that I made when I was pastoring, Helen, you're the one that you were saying that you assumed that they would get married, right? Okay, so I made the assumption that they were, how do I put this gently, stronger believers than I thought, right? So again, I'm the pastor, and of course, I'm so focused on the development of their faith, and how close are they drawing to Christ, and is Christ the center of your marriage, and just really pounding that message in. And I didn't realize that a lot of the people in church, they're pleasers. They want to please me. They want to please me, the pastor. And so a lot of times they will put up as I'm saying these things, Christ is center, and they're probably saying outwardly, of course, yes, but then in the quietness of their heart, they may be very far from Christ. But here I am thinking that they're saying all the right things to me, right? So I don't want to assume that they are the fervent believers that I thought that they are, or that I want them to be. I really want to, if I could take it all back, I would make it very, very, I would make the discussion very approachable. And I would want to say to them, I don't assume that you are so close to Christ and that you truly do, at this point in your life, want Christ to be central in your life. I don't want to make that assumption. And if you say to me that he is not central to your life right now, or central to your marriage, for lack of better terms, I'm okay with that, right? And it's weird for me to say that as a former pastor, but I just know, just humanly speaking, what happens when we just put up fronts with each other. And so I want to have a very honest discussion about spirituality, about negotiations between the two of you. Let's talk about sex. Let's talk about so many things that people preparing for marriage need to talk about, and doing away with the veneer of saying like, oh yeah, like because we're on praise team or because we're deacons or because we're whatever, that we're like these such gung-ho Christians. I mean, of course you're going to say that to me because I'm your pastor, and you want my approval for your wedding. You want me to officiate your wedding. But I think it's up to the pastor to actually strip away that pressure from the get-go, because they're not going to strip it away. You got to be the one that strips it away, So that's one thing that I'd like to contribute to the conversation.
I love that. And I feel like that builds a lot of safety too for the couple. Right?
That's terrifying for the pastor though.
Yeah.
It is terrifying because we're not used to that. We're not used to having these people say to, for me to clear the ground of shrapnel and rubble and things like that, and say to them like, you can be completely honest with me, and they'll say to you, yeah, you know what, Pastor Roy, I don't have any faith. And I'm like, oh man, like, and now I got to deal with this stuff, which is extra complicated, but I think it's still so necessary to have that conversation.
Yes, and so meaningful. Yeah.
I would agree. And I think that's where a lot of the couples that I've worked with that are, in church settings feel like they can't have those conversations, or they feel that pressure to put up this front and this facade. But that is where it's so necessary, needed. And whether or not the couple chooses to accept the pastor's offer, that's on them, right?
Yes.
But I understand the hesitance with that too, but it would be so helpful.
Yeah. Next question. Okay, so Annie, you mentioned prepare and enrich, and that kind of ties in with this question. Is there a structure or a plan that I can follow for premarital counseling? So prepare and enrich is something that not just therapists can do, but pastors can as well, right?
Right, that's right. Yeah, I think it's, they do trainings live or online, and it gives you a structure. There's kind of assessment that the couples do. It kind of comes out with this report that I think a lot of couples find pretty helpful, and that looks at different domains of their relationship. And then there's a workbook that comes with the program where it goes over a lot of the topics that Helen, you mentioned. And so, yeah, I think that's a pretty good guide to sort of help pastors facilitate the process.
Yeah, good. Helen, any other resource or plans or structures that you can think of that either you or colleagues use for premarital?
I did also put prepare and enrich down. I think that's a really useful, widely used tool. I also put down the 5 love languages by Gary Chapman. And it's just, most people, they are aware of their love language, but they don't realize how, maybe the love language that they identify with is also the way that they give love and show love and receive love. And if those are different, then the couple could feel like they're just missing each other, right?
Yeah.
What do you mean I don't do anything for you? What do you mean I don't show how much I love you? I do all these things, but it's not meaningful to the other person. So that's something that I found to be really helpful. And there's a lot of therapists. This is a specific training for therapists. It's called restoration therapy. It's about communication and conflict resolution. I use that a lot. I use it with my couples. I use it with individuals too, because when they can see their conflict, their pattern of conflict, it's a lot easier to be able to try to behaviorally modify that to have a different outcome. So that's a model that I use as well.
Okay. That's great. Go ahead, Annie.
One more. I love the book Hold Me Tight by Dr. Sue Johnson. And at the end of each chapter, there are some questions that can help either, as an individual, as a couple reading the book to reflect on. So Sue Johnson's, she developed emotionally focused therapy, which is kind of the gold standard couples therapy approach. So I really love that book. A lot of times, I mean, it depends on where the couple's at, but I have had a lot of couples that's like, wow, it just like perfectly described our relationship and helped them to gain a deeper understanding of their dynamics.
Yeah. Kevin asked the title for the pattern of conflict. So yeah, restoration therapy, that's the pain cycle and the peace cycle that they talk about in that book, which I've yet to read, but and partly because I don't really do a whole lot of couples counseling, but I do know that it's a very helpful model for a lot of couples. Good. Let's see here. And I do know that a lot of pastors, they gravitate towards The Meaning of Marriage by Tim Keller. And I have not read that myself, and I love Tim Keller's preaching. But again, I want to exercise caution that when we go into spiritual books, such as anything written by Keller, or I don't know whether some of those other titans, right, of today's Christianity are concerned, the pastor needs to go in with the mindset and kind of freeing themselves of the assumption of where the couple is at, spiritually speaking. We may recommend a book like Meaning of Marriage and things like that, but we're just not quite sure how it will land if they're going through a season where they're either angry at God, or they got some real baggage to kind of address in their life. So I think maybe having a mixture of things, something that is spiritually based, but really having eyes wide open and giving them the freedom to share things as transparently as possible without any sort of fear of judgment from the pastor. And then all other more kind of therapy-driven books, such as Restoration or Hold Me Tight or things like that. These can be a potent, 1-2 punch, I guess, for them. But when it comes to things like Prepare and Enrich, it's very neutral. It's just question asking, and not so much teaching, but it's like, okay, so you guys are pretty far apart in your financial scores. Let's talk about that. Where do you want to be? What level of agreement do you want to have? What will it take to get there? That sort of thing. It's very neutral. There's not a whole lot of instruction, I guess, involved as maybe a Meaning of Marriage might be. Yeah, these are some great questions. Should my wife be a part of sessions? So the pastor's wife, should the pastor's wife be a part of these premarital counseling sessions, or should it be just me? What do you guys think?
I put down if the couple, if they don't mind it, I think it would be helpful to have different perspectives on topics that are discussed.
Yeah, I think to me, it's not necessarily a should, I think it can. The wife, the pastor's wife can definitely be involved. The couple's open to it, and the pastor and the pastor's wife are both open to it. I do think that some couples, and when they're engaged, really want to look for models of like other couples. So in that aspect, that could be really beneficial and meaningful.
You mean just seeing the pastor and the wife kind of play off each other?
Yeah, like in the way they kind of just model,
Yeah.
marriage and being partners.
Right.
A lot of engaged couples are seeking for that. So
Right. Good. Okay. So let's pause again and let's see whether there are any follow-up questions from the topics that we've covered so far.
I mean, this might get discussed more in detail a little bit later. And I think what was really helpful was when you guys mentioned, don't assume that engagement means marriage automatically. And so maybe there have been instances where you've kind of counseled couples like, hey, maybe this is not the best, wisest kind of course of action to enter into this marital covenant. And so how do you go about that, doing that wisely? What are some, flags to look out for? And, it's kind of the nature of relationships in the church. It's like, it has real ramifications for, how I can continue to minister to them after they kind of make this decision, or if I, encourage them to kind of make this decision. And so kind of keeping that pastoral church context in mind as well. So what might be
Yeah.
some counsel there?
Great question.
I ask a lot of open-ended questions, and it's really for the couple to come to their own conclusions of, things that they may be far apart on. A lot of times couples think, oh, we'll figure it out as we go, or, oh, there are certain things that cannot be figured out. If one person wants to live on the West Coast and another person wants to live on the East Coast, what does that look like? And there's no compromising with that. No matter where a couple decides to go, one of them is going to be resentful. They're going to, harbor a lot of bitterness. So it's really kind of focusing the couple on what are their patterns of communication, conflict resolution. Do they really feel confident in their ability to walk through life together, even in those valleys, and even when things get super, super tough? And it's really, it's a choice, right? So whether they choose to walk together or not, it's a choice too. But I think giving them that option, that it's their choice, and do they believe that they can do this? I think that's the biggest difference, is really kind of, as therapists, is really honing in on what the couple believes that they can do, because ultimately it's them that have to walk through their life together.
Yeah, and I think along with that, kind of mirroring to the couple what you see as the concerns or the struggles. But yeah, I think, my role as a therapist might be different from what you're asking specifically in terms of the role of a pastor. But generally as a therapist, I'm more invested in the process and the actual outcome. So, it's not my role to tell them whether or not to break engagement or to get married or not. But I really help them see, what are the current kind of concerns and struggles, and do they feel that they can do the work and kind of get through those hurdles and challenges. Yeah.
One of the toughest things for me to transition out of is the pastoral hat that I wore. When I was pastoring, there was it was heavy, but it was also kind of like alluring, this sense of authority that I had. I wanted it and I didn't want it. And I felt like I could tell people, yeah, you guys should not get married. And I feel like comfortable doing that because like I was the pastor, And then when I became a therapist, I had to unlearn that, and to, as Helen was saying, really put this upon the couple to make that choice. And I think that's going to be one of the hardest things for a pastor to do, is to give the couple that sort of choice, when if you can really sense with your spider senses that this is going to be a really, really bad marriage, and this is going to be toxic, not just for them, but for their families, but also for the church. There's going to be that part of you as a pastor says, okay, let me nip this in the bud right now and say, don't get married, And, pastors do that. And, is that the right call or not? I don't know. But I do know that it's important to be aware of that. And as a therapist, as I have done premarital, I think I've never gone to a place where I would say you guys should not get married. But I would go so far as to say, I've got major concerns, and this is why, like your scores, are as far apart as can be. And from what the stats show, these are the types of conflicts that develop when your scores are this far apart. I might give them some horror stories, and I'm not going to say you guys are going to follow this stat, but I will say that more often than not, these types of unresolved issues lead to these types of conflicts. And I'm just frankly very, very concerned, about your impending relationship. I just have to leave it at that. Now, again, I'm in a different role than what a pastor is in. And so, I guess it's easier for someone like me to just kind of say, well, I did my job by giving you the warning. But a pastor now has to deal with that person, those two people getting married, staying in the church, the perennial conflicts that develop, and them coming to the pastor over and over again. And now maybe dealing with separation or maybe the divorce of that couple. It's a lot of stuff that the pastor needs to deal with. So I guess take it with a grain of salt that therapists aren't in a position to tell the couple don't get married, but I think it's reasonable for a pastor to say, I've got major concerns. And there are pastors who will also say, I've got such level of concern that I can't officiate your wedding. I know that pastors do that. And I actually don't blame them for doing that because their conscience is just torn apart, right? They can't in good conscience be up there officiating their wedding when they know just how toxic their relationship is.
I would agree. I wanted to kind of add that even in therapy, it talks about is when would I be able to tell, right? If a couple should or should not stay together. And my biggest boundary for that is if a couple is in a DV situation, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, that is something where I still don't tell the couple you shouldn't be together, but I do kind of put up that DV wheel, the power and control and what that looks like, because all those things about career moves, finances, child rearing, like it falls somewhere in that wheel too. And that is something where if they are in this dynamic of this power dynamic of control and coercion, that is something that I will call out in the couple.
Do you two pastors know what the DV wheel is?
I do not. I'm assuming it stands for domestic violence, but not familiar with DV wheel.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to describe what the DV wheel is?
It's a power and control wheel, and it talks about what a healthy relational dynamic looks like, and then what an unhealthy dynamic looks like. And a lot of times one partner is manipulative. They will blame, their partner, saying, I behave like this because you did this. And it turns into this very, very condescending. It makes the other partner feel very, very small. And they kind of feed into this system that the other partner sets up. And it's this dynamic where when we talk about toxic relationships, this is epitome of what a toxic relationship will look like. And so I do have it. I can, maybe I could send it to you, Roy. Maybe you could disperse it. But there are models for that and what it looks like, and to kind of help the couple gauge where they are at in that wheel too.
So yes, domestic violence and abuse is definitely a red flag that we should be looking for. And so another question here is, are there certain red flags or yellow flags that we should be looking for when counseling in premarital?
Yeah, so I do agree, what Helen's saying in terms of abuse. I mean, that's a huge flag. Usually I won't even see couples together. If there's intimate partner violence, it's kind of a contraindication. I think other signs of, kind of potential issues. I really like John Gottman's research, and his book, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, is also a really good one and a really kind of quick book for couples to read. And so his research, he kind of looked at, different couples come into his lab, they talk to each other, and then he's able to kind of predict, which couple's going to stay married and which couple's going to get divorced. In terms of the danger signs that he noticed would be things, he called it the 4 horsemen of apocalypse. So it's criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So when he observed couples with these specific things that they do, that oftentimes those are, potential danger signs. I think different levels of commitment is something to watch for too. Like sometimes one person is really fully leaning in and the other person's already kind of leaning out of the relationship, right? And especially if they're, kind of engaged, that's, a lot of times couples are so happy, right, in that stage of their relationship. So I think that can be a concern. I think if there's any past or current infidelity or any other significant issues of trust or kind of history of abuse or history of trauma, those could be potential challenges.
And I think if you do the prepare enrich material, which I find is very, very helpful, it's kind of built in. I think the yellow flags are built in there. You'll find that there are key areas where they are far apart in their their understanding of it, and their stance on things. And so if they are that far apart and they don't have good negotiation skills, yeah, that's a setup for a long time of conflict and discord in their marriage. So okay, and we talked about some. Yeah, go ahead.
I had a quick question. Sorry, but I was wondering, when you have like a couple who sort of like doesn't seem super interested in the sessions, like you're meeting with them, but they're just kind of like, and just sort of not really getting in depth, things like that. I feel like it's a little bit different for therapy because, like they're paying you guys. So there's kind of a like, even if they're not participating, at least one of them might be, because they're thinking about paying money and all of that. But what should we do, like, just to at least give them something to leave with? Would it just be like get them to do prepare enrich and then let them kind of look at it themselves? Because I don't want to waste their time or my time, if they don't want to be there. So just kind of was wondering if there's something we can do to make that time more productive, or at least for everyone to get something out of it.
What a good question.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I think
Sorry,
I feel like it might be interesting to even just think out loud the way you did, like with the couple, just really leaning into what you're picking up on and being curious with them.
Yeah.
And getting some data about that.
Yeah. Well, Annie, what would be an example of just kind of being curious, like verbally?
Yeah, just even what the pastor just said right now, right? It's like wondering out loud, like I'm noticing, like it seems like, you're here, but you're not saying a whole lot right now. I'm just wondering, like, what's it like to even like come in and talk to me?
Great example. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And kind of putting it back on the couple, what would be more helpful for you?
Yeah.
Like, if you'd like to discuss, how can we make best use of this time together?
Yeah.
This is a related question to that, but what about couples that are just not very self-aware? Like when I ask them about things, they're just kind of like, oh yeah, we're good, well, let's talk about that. And then they just go like, yeah, we fight sometimes, and like I get mad, but then I get over it. And you're sort of like, is there anything more to that we can talk about? Or should we just kind of meet them where they are and just say, okay, if that's it, then that's it. Like,
there's some level of meeting them where they are. I think sometimes also normalizing challenges can be really helpful. All couples fight, and maybe describe like what some fights could look like. What happens when the two of you fight? Yeah.
When I encountered couples like that, well, first I had to get over my own frustration, right? As a therapist, it's like, oh my gosh, like you people, right? But once I get over that, I, because I had a bit more time, I don't know how much time pastors have to do this, but I went into family of origin stuff. I asked them about their parents' marriages, and I asked them because I would. My guess is that majority of these people, they followed after the pattern of either their dad or their mom, when it comes to how they engage in the relationship, right? So, I would ask them, when your mom was like this or when your dad was like that, like, how did mom and dad handle that? And is that the way that you also want to handle it? And just kind of being more exploratory, because I think they're presenting themselves to you in a very kind of mundane way and just kind of go with the flow and everything. But they probably learned that from somewhere. And, if that's what they consider to be their ideal version of marriage, well, okay, that's okay for them, I guess. But there might be some of them who say, no, that's not what I want. And actually the way that we're doing it, I feel kind of trapped. in this cycle, but maybe they feel a little bit afraid of saying that, you know? And so sometimes you as a pastor asking them questions can reveal a lot of things that, a lot of helpful emotions that maybe they haven't quite learned how to share with each other by themselves yet. You know, they might need a third party such as you to kind of bring that out of them.
Yeah.
You know what I was also thinking of too, when, you know, a lot of couples, they're not very, you know, they talk about their conflict in a very convoluted way, right? They say, oh, but we got over it in a couple of days, or it's fine. Well, is it really fine, or does it come out, you know, at a different and at a future point? And, you know, we always talk about how couples, they fight in the same way about 1,000 different things, but really it's not about the fight. There's something underneath. It's that dynamic, like what is feeding into that, and really kind of leaning into what does that look like when you get into a fight? And yes, if your partner gets over it, do they really get over it, or does it come up again in the future? And more often than not, it comes out in different ways.
I agree.
I know you guys mentioned earlier about not being afraid to kind of press in on certain things. But there were times where we kind of were like, this sounds like it requires like much deeper work, like individual work. And I don't think this is the time or place. And I also don't think we want to do that with them. I don't think that's the nature of what this is. And we just sort of encourage them to get individual counseling. And I have no idea if they did or not. But is that okay, or should we like press in more? Or
great question,
especially when we get into family of origin stuff, like a lot of, you know, dirt kind of comes up about their relationship with their parents, that like, you know, this one guy was like really mad at his dad, and my wife and I were sort of like, that sounds really you know, concerning, but we also didn't want to either scare them or get too deep into it the settings. So yeah, I was a little confused as to what we should do, or like what the right course of action was in those situations, because of my lack of experience as a counselor and a therapist, as a pastor.
Great question.
Yeah,
sounds to me really appropriate to refer them to professional counseling, and individual work is great. I think also in that case, they may benefit from, you know, couples therapy with a professional counselor as well.
I would agree. I think that's really helpful, is just knowing your limitations. We all have them. That's why we have limits of confidentiality as therapists as well. So if it can be framed in a more positive way, where it's not, oh, this sounds too deep for me, you need professional help. It's, you know, a therapist, it's another resource. It's someone to help you have an unbiased perspective, to help you work through different conflicts or different challenges. I think if it's framed that way, you know, hopefully they'll be a little bit more open.
Okay, everyone. Thanks for joining the call.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's so helpful.
Super helpful.
Okay, have a great week. Bye.
Good week. Bye, everyone.